I never, ever wanted to make a log cabin quilt, to the point that it took years for me to change my mind and embrace them. I'm Michelle. This is my romantic tangle, and my first experience with a quilt shop turned me off from quilting in general and log cabin quilts in particular for quite a while. I wanted to learn to quilt. And to tell you how long ago this happened, this quilt shop was in an industrial strip mall behind the old Kmart, next to a bookstore, which is how I stumbled upon it. And I went in and I looked at the pretty fabric and I asked the lady about a particular pattern that I saw and liked, telling her at that point I had sewed a lot of clothing. I was familiar with my sewing machine. I knew how to do a seam allowance, and I figured quilting couldn't be that hard. No, she told me that everybody has to take a class and everybody's first quilt has to be a log cabin quilt. And I looked at the log cabin quilt hanging behind the counter, which was a perfectly wonderful beginner's pattern. It had the wide 3-inch strips of however many colors you need to make a basic log cabin quilt. And I thought about the price of the class, and I thought about the price of the supplies for the class for a quilt that I didn't like, and took the flyer and went home and did not learn to make a quilt for a while. One day I was looking at quilting magazines and found instructions for making a diamond in a square block from a square and a rectangle of fabric, and I decided to give it a try, not realizing that cutting the rectangle the way I did was going to give me bias edges, or that I was supposed to worry about bias edges. I plunged right in and it worked, and it is a stretch to call this a quilt top. It's not gorgeous, but for a first attempt, I don't think it was awful. After I made that first quilt, I was not quite off and running. My youngest two sons are spaced 15 months apart, and that was in, I think, August of the year between the two births. And we were moving houses, and I had a lot going on. So there were some long breaks in quilting, but time passed. I made more tops, I made more quilts, I got more creative. I was doing everything but a log cabin quilt at that point. My mother had made a log cabin quilt since then. My daughter, who is 11 years old, made a log cabin quilt. The two of them decided, just to spite me, that you couldn't be a real quilter if you hadn't made a log cabin quilt, because I got to compete with my 11-year-old, you know. And I was not going to make one until a friend of mine was making a log cabin quilt using the Quilt in a Day pattern book. I had my mom's copy of the book down at my house. She had her copy of the book 50 miles away at her house, and I was talking her through the process because I didn't want to do it, but I could see how it was done. And I had purchased a panel of fabric that was a dinosaur themed soft book that I wanted to cut the pages into separate pieces and make a quilt. I had a little stack of texture green fabrics, and a light bulb went off, and I thought log cabin blocks would be the perfect setting for these pages. So I did that. This is exactly the type of quilt that I did not want to make, but the log cabin blocks worked so well between those dinosaur blocks and made more sense than any other options I had been able to come up with. And not long after I did that, I was looking at something else, because by this time our internet speed was a little faster and I was spending a little more time online, and I saw a quilt. Someone had done a log cabin quilt with 1.5-inch Scrappy strips. And I had bags of thrift store scraps, and I made one, and I fell in love with it. And about halfway through making my own, Christmas was coming. I had shown Grandma the blocks I had of mine, and she really liked it. And I wanted to make Grandma one before Christmas. I did not want to give her mine. So there are twins of this log cabin quilt. And then I had so much fun and still had so many 1.5-inch strips. I made a courthouse steps, which is basically a variation on the log cabin block. And then there was this courthouse steps, which is a Moda jelly roll that I cut in half lengthwise to get 1 1/4 strips to make it. And somewhere along the line, I decided I really like log cabin quilts. There are a lot of different setting possibilities and variations that I am looking forward to trying. But that first encounter turned me off of them for so long. I had forgotten about it until a couple of weeks ago when I was watching a YouTube video where a creator was selling her sewing class, and she had certain projects that she said, even if you don't like the finished product, you should take the class and do it so you learn the skills. And it was the same exact interaction I had with that quilt shop owner. There's more than one way to learn how to cut a piece of quilt or to put in a zipper or to do whatever her techniques she was teaching were. So maybe we should, first of all, not be put off quite so strongly if the option somebody suggests isn't what you want to do. And second of all, let's maybe not tell new quilters and knitters and stitchers that this is what has to be your first project. Because even when I did home ec in middle school, we had 2 options. They were very limited options, but at least they were options. Let me know what you think. Do you take classes? Have you made something you didn't want to make so that you could learn the skills involved in that class? Or do you just do what I did and kind of wing it and make a mess with thrift shop supplies and library books? I would love to hear your stories. I'm Michelle. This is my romantic tangle, and I've got lots more to share with you soon.